we've just published our new book and it's finally arrived, and we thought it'd be useful to kind of do a video that looks at the gown and some of its details and also kind of includes what's in the book, so you kind of get a heads up of what's in there. So this is the gown. It's called a nightgown here in the UK. This is the English name for it. Basically, the French kind of fall in love with it in the latter half of the 18th century, and they give it a new name. They call it the robe of the English, or robe à l'anglaise. And that's probably the name that most of you know it by. And ironically, for a gown that has the word night in its name, it's actually, particularly here in the UK, kind of like the most popular day gown that gets worn. And the book starts looking into the reasonings behind that. And actually for us, it's almost one of the most interesting elements to this gown is this name, nightgown. And when we first started writing the book, we actually were spelling it nightgown as one word without the dash. But we were just coming across source after source after source of it being spelt with the dash, that we've put the dash in and we've respelt it. And actually wonderfully, now it's published, going back through the book, we found two sources where the old spelling is in there. So if you're up for a challenge, they're in there. But anyway, so just with the gown on the table, we just thought we'd take a look at some of the details, kind of follow the layout of the book a little bit. So the book starts off just with an opening overview of the gown. So if we just do that, if we just look at some of its key details. So we'll just start off with this section because it's easy accessible, but this is called a robing. And this bit here, this is the trim, but it's actually called here in the UK a furbelow. And this kind of comes from the anglicised word of faibler from French. And this box pleated decoration, do you see how it's every now and then you've got like a prominent box pleat? That's really indicative of the 1760s, and that's one of the features that help date this gown. And then they lie on top of a robing, and this format, this very simple folded strip of cloth that finishes this front edge, that's really kind of like a standardised method by the time you get to the 1760s. So that's kind of like another dating tool. But the robings actually come from when the gown was made out of a wider length of cloth, and they were folding the robings up to shape them into the waist. So they were really functional and they were practical. Whereas this, by now, it's just become like a shadow of that. It's just come to finish the edge. It hides the top of the sleeves here and then flows into the side back pleat here. And you'll find a lot of sack backs, a lot of mantuas, a lot of nightgowns keep this flow over the shoulder. And that's another thing that's kind of discussed in the book because that's a hugely interesting feature. So in between the robings, if I just open her up like this, so it's a really heavily pieced lining section. And the whole purpose of the book wasn't just to kind of teach a standard method for making these gowns, it was to report on the construction techniques found in this gown. So this pieced lining, it features in the order of making. If I just flick to the page quickly. So the order of making literally takes you step by step through all of the gown. I can't find the page. Here we are. So it teaches the piece lining. But when we were preparing for the book, it was kind of like this debate of whether we did the complex piece lining or if we did a simpler lining version. But the whole point was to provide the actual techniques found on the gown. So for those who find that a little bit complex, we've also included in the patterns and in the instructions a simpler lining grid. And then there's instructions as well. But that's kind of, I'm saying that to kind of explain the heart behind the book is to literally kind of record the sewing techniques that we can find on this gown. And if you're wondering why there is piece lining, that's a really good question. From the evidence found on the gown, we think we've broken it down into kind of 4 stages. So the gown was probably originally made somewhere between the 1730s and 1740s. Then at some point during the 1740s, the whole gown gets unpicked, the fabric turned over and gets resewn. And then at some point around the early 1750s, early 1760s, the same thing happens again. The whole gown gets unpicked, the fabric gets turned over and it gets resewn. And then the final 4th stage is that we think they just do like a little minor fashion adjustment and they change the robings from the the 1750s, early 1760s style to actually this box pleat. So that's the kind of the stage layout. So this piece lining, we think, represents that stage between the first remake, so when it's in the 1740s, early 1750s, and the 1750s, early 1760s remake, and that we think it represents how much they've been able to enlarge the gown by and lengthen. And all of this earlier versions and kind of look at the old marks, that's actually features in one of the chapters in the book called the earlier versions. So we've actually put, as best we can, all the marks onto a grid layout so that you can either compare them to a gown that you're studying that has other alteration marks, or that you can try and kind of play detective and see what you think the earlier gown might have looked like. So that's in the earlier version section of the book. So while we're on this earlier versions things, it's really easy to do a close-up photo in a book, but it's actually really hard to kind of keep the context of it. So one of the things we want to do a close-up of is the trim. This is one of the prime interesting bits of that fourth stage. So if you see here, you can see a central fold mark, and you can see staggered dots either side of that fold mark. Now that is the very standardised method of folding and gathering up the pleat for the decoration for the furbelows. If we just go a stage further, you can see on the trim an even older mark. So can you see this line here? Very slight scuffing. That appears every now and then throughout the trim. And we think that it actually represents the cuff. So they've unpicked the cuff and they've used it to create the trim. Okay, and then in the same area, what we have here just beneath the robings, and actually it's another really fascinating thing that the robings are loose. A lot of gowns, the robings are loose, and actually often the ones that aren't loose, you can see modern day stitching, and whether it's conservation reasons or for dressing in a museum, that it's safer to slightly secure the robings. But the fact that so many robings are predominantly loose kind of gives this idea that whatever stitching is holding them down is slightly looser, or that they're being pinned down. And this kind of speaks of dressing. Is it that these robings are being loosely stitched down for dressing, or that they're being not sewn at all and just pinned, and that's why they're loose? So even the fact that something's come undone is quite interesting. And if I just move that there, because from this viewpoint here, you can see this mark here. And just under here, you can see this mark here. Now, this is what we call the long body dart. And this inner fold here and that mark there, that's evidence of an older bust dart. So you can see that the construction for the 1750s and 1760s has sewn another dart in a slightly different area. And this long body dart and this bust dart, that's one of the things that we think sort of shows that it's from that 1730s, 1740s construction date, because you don't really see these two darts together again after really the 1740s into the 1750s. It kind of loses. You see the bust dart quite oftenly throughout the construction of the nightgown or the sack back, but it's even following that. The history of the bust dart is interesting enough, but to have this long body dart, that's slightly older, we think. And you get some of those images where they're really shaping the gown over the top of the stays. And we think that that's it's really helping accentuate that shape. So that bust dart and the stitching and all of that is in the grid in the book. So I'm now just going to turn her over. Because the details from the back are a little bit more indicative of a nightgown than the front. Really, from the fronts, you can't always tell if something's a sack back gown or a nightgown. I mean, the mantua is slightly different. But it's from the back that you can really see what kind of gown it is. And here on the back, I'll just support that a little bit. So these are the back pleats, and this is really what makes a nightgown a nightgown. You get these same back pleats on mantuas too, and they're functional. They're not just decorative, even though they clearly are decorative as well. If I just lift up the edge here, you can see that this is an actual pleat folded edge, and then if you see these lines here, that's actually the inner fold coming back in and the return of the pleat. And their stitching is really kind of curious because, again, it's blending a decorative element with a functional, but the stitching sizes, they're not massively tight. It's not holding a lot of strain or weight. They tend to be about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 apart, these dots. This is a running stab stitch. Again, we use this term running to explain the forward motion of the different types of stitch. So you can do this stab stitch in a back stitch format. But the original makers, they use a running format. So we discussed that in the book. Again, that's a huge part of our research. But this is decorative. It's holding the pleats down, but there's not a whole lot of strength to the stitching, which is quite interesting. So you have 2 back pleats. This is the centre back pleat, and this comes into the skirts and right down to the hem. And the same with the side back pleat. This is still one piece of cloth, and that's coming down into the skirts here, and then again right down to the hem. So this, from this top here, this has been pieced along here, but from this top line here, right down to the bottom, that's one panel of cloth, and then the skirts get attached to the side of that. And this piecing at the top here, this represents where they're lengthening the proportions of the alteration, you know, the people they were remaking the gown for, they're lengthening and widening it. And going back to those old marks again, it's on the back pleats that you can really see some more evidence of those. You know, when we said they turned the cloth over, there's 2 places where you can really see evidence for this, the back pleats and in the seams of the skirt. So while we've got the gown here, let's just have a look at the back pleats. So can you see these 2 lines here? This one running up here, and this one's, you know, runs up here. And you've actually got corresponding line of stitching damage here, following it exactly. That is one of the stages that was folded, stitched down to create the same kind of back pleats as we have here. But if you look up in the same kind of area, we actually have a verted pleat here. Slightly older, it's got some wear on it, so we know it was there for a longer time, and that represents probably the first making stage when it was made up, and then it's been unpicked, turned over, and remade, and then it's been unpicked, turned over and remade again, which is why we have those 2 back pleat folds in very similar areas, but one's inverted pleat damage and one's a verted pleat damage. So we've been really curious as to why there's so much similarity between the nightgown and the mantua. And we're actually involved in a project that's researching mantuas, it's recording sewing techniques, looking at the evolution, and partly with this real goal of comparing it to the nightgown, comparing it to the sewing methods found in sackback gowns. And really our goal is, our heart is, to create a massive database where you can really compare dart sizes, dart positions, you know, pleats, all that sort of thing, that you can really begin to see how things are made and where the similarities are and where the differences are. But so this book is actually our first opportunity to kind of share some of our research, share why we think the nightgown and the mantua are so similar, and even how they're similar to the sackback gown. So if you're interested in that kind of evolution of 18th century costume, because really the robe à la française, the robe à l'anglaise, they are the main gowns for 18th century costume, and I believe they're hugely linked to the mantua and to an earlier movement back in the 1670s, 60s of this déshabille, this undress. But anyway, that's in the book, and we're still doing research, so we're hoping to sort of do more papers and cover this in future publications. But that's the kind of the gown in a nutshell. Certainly there's way more details in the book, like there's other mark areas on the gown that we go into more detail. We obviously do a lot more on the construction side of it. But that's just a good introduction and to give you a good idea of what is in the book. So all of this that we've talked about today, this is covered in the book. And you can just use this book to simply enjoy making a 1760s nightgown and kind of have the thrill of this idea that you're using original techniques. But you can also use this book to really kind of use it as part of your 18th century research, whatever you're researching right now. If you've been studying sort of similar dated gowns and you want another example, then the idea is that this book hands into your hands, stitching sizes, close-up photos, areas of it's being altered or area of its construction, so you can compare that to other gowns that you've studied for your own research. Or if you're a museum and you've got your own collection and you've got a gown from a very similar date, the idea is that you can use this book to help you understand your gown or compare it to see if they're altered in similar ways. And the third reason is also that we speak about these techniques in the order of making, and we don't just want you to take our word for it. We kind of like the idea that you can flick back to the close-up photos in the book, from the order of making to the report, and really kind of see how the 18th century maker is using that stitch that we're teaching in the order of making. So we'd love to see some of the gowns you might make from this book, or the projects that you've used this book in, or if you have any thoughts on our research, come and join the debate with us. If you are interested in the research side of this, we actually do Patreon. We're on Patreon. And we share a lot more of the nitty-gritty bits of our research on there. Not everything you can share on Facebook and Instagram, it's too long and wordy. But Patreon, it's a good platform to really get into the research side of things. So come and join us there. And if you haven't purchased the book, it is available for sale on handboundcostumes.co.uk. And if you go into the shop section, there's a book section on the shop, so you can purchase it from that. Thank you so much for watching.